I'm Yorick. I'm from MC Solar and Electrical, and I'm here to not give you a sales spiel on solar. So rest assured, this is not a sales consultation. This is very much about basically running through what we think about when we're trying to design a solar battery system for a fully sustainable household. So just to give you a little bit of a rundown about me. So I'm not just a salesperson or a solar consultant, but I have been in the industry for about 10 years now. So I originally started off doing some door-to-door lead generation for a company. I was actually trying to get an electrical apprenticeship at the time, and somebody knocked on my door and I thought, oh, this might be a good opportunity to get a foot in the door. So that was about 11 years ago now. So from an aspiring Sparky to consultant, so what I ended up doing was I did door-to-door for a while before being given the opportunity to get up on the tools. So I was up on the roof doing some solar installations, and then I got asked if I could help out as service manager. So I got a job basically figuring out where systems had gone wrong and dealing with those warranty claims before the company I worked for went under and they went bankrupt. So I got a call not that long afterwards from our operations manager at MC Electrical and was asked if I could help out dealing with a lot of the service calls that we were dealing with at the time. And that's how I ended up at MC Electrical. And since then, obviously I have moved into the consultancy role now, which is what I do today, but I also host on the MC Electrical YouTube channel, conveying my knowledge on ideally batteries, EV charging. It's what I'm most passionate about, along with other topics as well. I don't just talk the talk, I also walk the walk. So at home, I've got a fairly large solar system up on my roof, around about 12 kilowatts. I drive an electric car. I like to take camping and use the vehicle to load function, which is a great feature of EVs. I've got batteries at home, as well as heat pumps, induction cooking. We got rid of the gas entirely. I spent a fair bit of money making sure my house was well insulated, and basically everything I could do to make my house more energy efficient and sustainable. So just to give a quick rundown about, I guess, some key points of what we're thinking about when we're looking at solar, because electricity is actually a really hard thing to visualize, and this is what catches a lot of people out when they're trying to figure out exactly what we're trying to do. So you can sort of think about your solar system as if we want to think about like electricity as if it's water, you can think about the array as a big water collector where we're going to collect a certain amount of energy. Then any of your power points, you can sort of think about as little taps. So the water's got to flow somewhere. We can have a battery, which could be, outside or inside the garage. We can sort of think that as a bit like as a water tank. So yeah, that's your storage mechanism. And then anything that's left over, because the power's got to go somewhere, we can push it up into the grid, or I like to think about it as a bit like a large dam at the top of the hill, which is infinitely large. And so it's all a fluid system. So that's sort of, I think, a very quick way of sort of thinking about how things flow. So there's no switching and telling, the power where to go. It's much more about, it's really a sort of a fluid network of sort of electrical pipes, which is what we call cables, and the power flows to where it needs to go. But a very common thing that people, I think, struggle with is the difference between watt hours or kilowatt hours and watts or kilowatts. So I think one of the most important things, at least for this talk, is to understand what is a kilowatt, which is sort of the flow rate of electricity or how quickly you're going to pull through the power, and then the kilowatt hours, which is sort of the total amount of energy or the amount of power that you've used throughout the whole day. And so just to give you a bit of a typical breakdown, like a pool pump, for example, will use about a kilowatt, but that might run for 8 hours. So that would give you about 8 kilowatt hours worth of electricity. A standard kettle might be about a kilowatt as well, or a big hot water system might be 3.5 kilowatts. So if that ran for 2 hours, that'll be about 7 kilowatt hours worth of electricity. So anyway, a typical household would probably use somewhere between about 20 to 40 kilowatt hours throughout the day, but they're not using necessarily the flow rate for that time will vary throughout the day. So once we've got the solar, or if you think about the solar, what's sort of the main sort of flow of power? Well, first the power will flow, or you'll capture it with your solar panels. It'll then flow to your power point. So that's sort of the path of least resistance. And then if you have a battery, we'll push the excess into the storage mechanism, which we actually have to force it in there. And then if the battery's full, or if you don't have a battery, then the pressure rises and we push, or the voltage rises and we push the power into the grid. So that's a nice way to think about where the electricity will flow. Now, if you're pulling power in at night, first we'll pull it from the battery, hopefully, or if you don't have a battery, it'll sort of flow down from the grid into the house, and that's where you'll pull it from. So there's no sort of turning it on and off. It's sort of just a fluid system throughout that whole process. I think a common misconception is putting on a really big solar system is the silver bullet, but it's not. With these days, I think if you were focused purely on saving money off your bills, yeah, putting on a big array used to be a good idea. But these days, we need to be a little bit more clever with that. So what I tend to look at realistically is, what do you need? What are they now? And what will they be in the future? And the other thing we need to look at is, what's the sun going to do for your roof? So do you have a lot of shade? Do you have a lot of, nice big roof area? We'll run through this in a little bit more detail. So this is just to quickly take you through some of the steps that we'll be thinking about. The next thing would be, how can we be smarter with our electricity? It's all well and good putting panels up on the roof, but if you're not using it effectively, that's not very good either. So we'll talk about how we can reduce electricity usage, how we can reschedule stuff to run things during the day, but then also lastly, how do we recapture that excess for usage at night and making us more sustainable? And then the last thing we'll talk about is a little bit about the duck curve, but I'll go through that in detail, and talking a bit about why putting on a really big solar system today is not necessarily the silver bullet it used to be, and the fact that there is so much excess solar in the grid today that it is becoming a bit of a problem, and why there might be two-way tariffs at some stage. Now, I'm not too worried about that myself, but it is something that people are concerned about when we're talking about the terribly named solar tax. This is a relatively simple graph, but basically when we're looking at putting a solar system up on the roof, the first thing that we want to be thinking about is, what is the usage inside that house? So I've got this graph here, and basically along the bottom we've got the time of the day, starting at midnight, through the morning, midday, afternoon, and then to midnight. And then we've got a production curve of what the solar system would produce on a really nice day. And then we can see the consumption in the house. So that'll also vary throughout the day here. So this is actually a day with a fair bit of power usage. Everything in yellow is power that was used directly from the solar during the day. The grey is the amount of power that was going to the grid. And then everything under this blue line outside of that curve is what you'd be buying in from the grid at night. So you can sort of think about it as, this disappears off your power bill. This is what you get paid for, for now. And then everything outside of this is what you pay for on your power bill after dark. Let's say we know roughly what a household uses. Let's say they're using around about, let's use easy numbers, 40 kilowatt hours a day. Okay, a typical solar system as an average for the year will produce about 4 times its rated array capacity. So if we had a 10 kilowatt array, it'll produce around about 40 kilowatt hours worth of electricity. Now, that's a pretty big system, but this is a very typical size that would tend to be installing today, especially if you're thinking about batteries. So we sort of think about, okay, well, let's say we know roughly what the house might use throughout the day. So we know that they've got electric hot water system, a pool, maybe they've got an electric car. So how do we sort of scale this production curve to that usage? So one thing we can do is we can put a bigger array on. Now, really putting a bigger array on, what that does is it stretches that bell curve. We can't really make it much wider than it is because we're limited by when the sun rises and the sun sets. But then we can sort of increase the amount of panels up until a point. We could put the panels all on the north and get this really nice sort of thin spike in the middle of the day, and that's what we used to do. So when you used to get high feed-in tariff, say when you got a 50-cent feed-in tariff, and some of you might already still be on that, you wanted as much power for a short period of time so you could push it all into the grid. Nowadays, I actually like to put panels on the east and the west. So it's less efficient in winter. In summer, it doesn't make that much of a difference. You can put panels on the south-facing roof, and in summer, the sun's directly in the top of the sky. It does basically the same, but what we're trying to do now is to basically stretch the power for as long as possible. So to try and get as early in the morning and as late in the afternoon. But so typically we might do something that's predominantly north and west facing to catch that afternoon sun, but still give you decent production in winter. But these aren't sort of exclusive of each other. We can put panels in basically all orientations. One of the things we do need to consider, especially if you're single phase, so this is where most houses would be, a standard single phase connection. 3-phase houses tend to be larger with big ducted air conditioning systems, but it's not a guarantee that it's 3-phase. But export limiting. So a standard connection in Brisbane would be a 5 kilowatt export limit. So that's basically how quickly you're allowed to flow power into the grid. And so if you did have a really big solar system, but your usage is quite low, well, the solar system has to limit its output to make sure you're not feeding more than the 5 kilowatts you're allowed to flow to the grid. So it's not a total amount of energy that's capped, it's just the flow rate. So what can happen here is if you've got an export limit, as your usage goes up, so can the production. So we might want to be a little bit clever when we use that power so that we're not, having panels sitting up there doing not a whole lot. One thing that is starting to become a more common thing to see, but it's still fairly rare, but give it a few years and I think it will become the norm, is what's called a dynamic connection. And it sounds a bit scary, but it's a pretty simple thing. So what it is that instead of just being told, okay, you're allowed to flow 5 kilowatts to the grid consistently, it'll vary between 1.5 kilowatts up to 10 kilowatts, depending on what the grid needs. So if it's a particularly sunny day and everyone's pushing lots of power into the grid, Energex might tell your inverter, don't flow all that power into the grid. You can only flow 1.5 kilowatts, but maybe at night, or if it's a bit of an overcast day and your system can produce a lot of power, you can still feed you might be able to feed the full 10 kilowatts into the grid. So you may not see as much of this clipping effect. But the thing about dynamic connections is it is going to become the norm down the track. Again, it's one of those things where we want to be a little bit more clever with our usage. The other factors that we tend to want to think about if we're designing a solar system, especially if we're looking at batteries or for houses which do use a bit of power during the day, is things like rainy days. Winter production is always going to be less, but also shading. So shade has by far the biggest impact on your solar production more than anything else. It's not to say you need to have every single panel on an inverter or like a microinverter or an optimizer, but you do want to be careful with putting panels in places that you know are going to get shade, especially in the middle of the day. So this isn't a shaded house, but this is just a day where it was a little bit overcast in the morning, but then it was obviously very miserable and wet in the afternoon. And we can see sort of how much of a difference in production that makes because the scaling is the same. So anyway, on a rainy day, you'll definitely produce less, and we want to make sure that we're going to have enough for those days as well. So what size is right? Well, it depends entirely on your use case. I've got some customers who have pools, they've got electric cars, they've got big ducted systems that they run all day because they work from home and they've got, want to keep the house cool. But I've got other houses where, they're a retired couple, they've got solar hot water, they don't use the aircon very much, and they can get away with a much smaller system. And the reality is both of these houses have batteries, and both of these houses, their systems are adequately sized for their needs, but one might seem a lot in excess and one might be considered a bit small. So it just depends on really what your use case is. But I like to think that while I like a big solar system, and I think a bigger solar system is generally the best way to go because that in the long term tends to give you sort of the most capacity to work with. Obviously, it's a bit wasteful if you have all this capacity and you're not needing to utilize it. I think the first, I guess once we've got the solar system up on the roof and we've sized it to what your needs are, how do we use it more efficiently? And I think the best thing to do is always make your house more efficient. And an easy way to do that is energy efficient appliances like LED lighting. The amazing thing about, at least in the 10 years that I've been doing this job, is I used to see customers who used a lot of power and lots of incandescent downlights. So a lot of houses built in the early 2000s had 50 watt incandescent downlights in every room, and you'd have 4 or 6 or 8 in a single room, and that's hundreds of watts of electricity with what we can now do with maybe 20 to 30 watts of electricity with LEDs. So LEDs use about 10% or 90% less than what an incandescent downlight uses. Even compared to fluorescence, LEDs use half that of a fluorescent light. But fluorescence is still pretty good, so I wouldn't rush out to change your fluorescence, but definitely if you've got incandescent downlights, that's one of the easiest and cheapest ways to reduce your usage, especially at night. The other thing too is generally they're a little bit more pleasant than fluorescence. LEDs nowadays tend to be a little bit more of a neutral color. They tend not to be sort of that hospital, pale blue. So I think that's a big upgrade. The next thing is heating. So generating heat is actually one of the most energy hungry things that we can do in a household, especially oil heaters, heating water, drying clothes, especially if you have an old venting dryer. One of the really interesting things, and I actually got caught out by this myself, is if you've got a dryer that you run regularly that is burning through power. And you can actually use significantly less by upgrading to a heat pump dryer, where you basically use like a little air conditioning compressor or a refrigerant compressor to move heat from one place to another. And they use about 60% less compared to a conventional dryer. I think it's probably better than that, but these are the specs that I was able to get. Hot water systems. So basically a conventional hot water tank is like a big kettle. It's just got a resistive element in it. For every kilowatt worth of electricity you put in, you get a kilowatt worth of heat out of it. Okay. The great thing about a heat pump hot water system is it's not actually generating heat. It's just sucking it out of the air and pushing it into a tank. And so what you can do is for every kilowatt of electricity you put in, you can get about 4 to 5 kilowatts worth of heat energy moved into that hot water. So it'll use around about 70% less. And then the other thing is heating. Now, it's winter at the moment, it's cold. It is far better to run your reverse cycle air conditioning than it is to put on, say, a electric element heater. It is a night and day difference in terms of the amount of energy that you will use. But it is fair to say with all of these things, there are limitations. The colder it gets outside, the less efficient these things will be. But the great thing is we live in a very warm, relatively tropical climate. When it's hot outside, heat pumps are incredibly efficient and will probably beat these numbers that I've listed here. And I think part of the reason, I guess another thing being living in a warm climate, is our houses are very poorly insulated. An interesting fact that I've read a few times now is a lot of homes, especially Queenslanders, are not that much better than tents in terms of our insulation. And I spoke to a customer about a week ago, and he was chewing through power keeping his house warm, and he was chewing through power keeping his house cold, and he was asking me, should I put on a bigger solar system? And I said, no, I think you're best off looking into spending a couple of $1,000s in insulating your house well, and that's, I think, his best option. So one of the amazing things as well is, and look, having grew up in Europe, I was born overseas, 72% of homes in Australia don't meet a 2-star efficiency rating. Now, it's hard to actually give you really good facts on what a 2-star rating is, but just to give you a contrast, every new house built as of 2024 has to be a 7-star rating or greater. So I think it would be something in the range of being not much better than the tent to something that's a bit closer to, say, the internals of a fridge. But don't quote me on those facts, on those figures. Anyway, but insulating your homes is another way we can reduce our usage quite drastically. Now, once we've brought down our usage, especially at night, then how can we move power that we might have otherwise used after dark into the day? And I think that one of the best things we can do is consumption monitoring. So most people have no idea what different appliances use and how much they're using at different times. It's a really hard thing to visualize. Electricity is invisible. So you don't necessarily have to use catch, but if you do get a solar system, almost everything today will come with some form of consumption meter. And so being able to see what you're producing and being able to see how much you're consuming and understanding how much you're consuming, I think is a really powerful tool in making your house more efficient. Because if you don't know what you're using, how can you make changes to positively impact that? So we can shift power into the day. So a hot water system is a really easy thing to do. It's basically a tank. It's a storage mechanism. Instead of running it after dark or on off-peak, we can put it onto a timer, shift it to run during the day, and ideally, when there is enough solar power, it fully covers your hot water your hot water electricity usage. It's basically solar hot water, but just through your solar system instead. Scheduling appliances, that's in the next step. Now, I'm probably not the best preacher on this. I tend to still run my dishwasher at night, but if you can make small changes where maybe you put the washing machine on a timer to run in the middle of the day instead of, just before you go to bed, those changes will help. And changing habits is really hard. So, while it's one of those things that it's definitely worth trying to do, it's not the end of the world if you occasionally do need to do it after dark. But if you do remember, okay, it's a nice sunny day, maybe I'll push the start button on the washing machine now. These all little changes all add up at the end of the day. And the next thing is smart EV charging. And not everybody's going to have an electric car, but they might down the track. And so the thing is, we might have excess solar power that we can push into a car. And so you can actually get electric car chargers. There's a few different brands out there, but Zappi is a very well-known brand. It's what I have myself, but Evnex, or Fronius Watt Pilot, but there's a whole list of them. Basically, what they can do is they can measure how much power you're importing and exporting from the grid. And if you're flowing 3 kilowatts into the grid, they just say to the car, hey, I'm a 3 kilowatt charger, pull 3 kilowatts. And so you eat up that excess. Or maybe you've got a bit more left over. Let's say you've got 5 kilowatts left over. It says to the car, now I'm a 5 kilowatt charger, and the car pulls that extra capacity. So you can get quite clever with these types of setups. But the other thing too is and we'll talk about this a little bit more down the track, but if you do have a battery and a car charger, you might want to set up priorities between the battery and the car battery. So anyway, consumption monitoring, I think, is a really powerful tool. So we've got the solar system, we've reduced our power consumption, we've shifted as much into the day as we can, and now we're looking at storing the excess power that we've got to get us through the night. And so the only real difference between this graph and the one that I showed you before is we've got this nice green portion of this curve, which otherwise would have been going to the grid, and this is what's going to the battery, and we've got this charge percentage of the battery here. Okay, so when we're looking at designing a battery, the first thing I always think about is what's the priority of that battery? Is it being installed for self-sufficiency, which probably in your case, that's the main focus. So maybe we look at putting the smallest battery we can on to get us through the night, most nights. We're not going to get us through every single night. You'll have some days you use more and sometimes we'll have rainy weather, but enough that you can charge it up during the day and then and that it can get you through the night so it doesn't completely discharge and you get this nice cycle. The next thing is we could be looking at a focus on backup. So I've got some customers with medical conditions where maybe getting through the whole night's not that important, but if there's a blackout, they want the power really quickly. So, or the ability to run the whole house if there's a blackout. So I've got some people who suffer from flash flooding and suddenly they might lose power for an hour or two. So that could be another thing. So we might size a battery maybe a bit smaller because it's not really focused on getting through the whole night, but we want it to be able to discharge really quickly and cover those high load items. Or virtual power plant, which sometimes is a bit of a dirty word, but basically what it is the ability to buy and sell power in and out of the grid, potentially to make a little bit of money. And we'll go through this in a bit more detail again later as well. But if we were looking at, say, wanting to buy and sell on the virtual power plant, we might want a bigger battery with a bit of excess capacity there so that you have some that you can trade. But a big thing would be the ability to dump that power into the grid really quickly, because if there's a spike in that power price that you're going to get paid for that power, you want to get as much in there as you possibly can and get as much money from the grid when it's worth doing it. Essentially, what we're looking at for sizing a battery, and look, this is predominantly before we had the battery rebates. Things have sort of skewed a little bit now. But generally, we wanted to look at how much extra solar power you were feeding into the grid, which would be that portion in grey before. And then we would have looked at how much power did you use outside of those production hours. And then we would have looked at, what are you using in summer? What are you using in winter? And then size the battery accordingly. And sometimes you might use a lot in summer, but very little in winter. And then you have to make a decision. Do you size it for the days you use a lot, or do you size it for the days you use very little? And what's the most appropriate for your needs there? The other thing you can do too is, look, if you want to be self-sufficient, solar only charging is sort of the main focus. So you use your excess solar to charge the battery, but you can also do grid charging too. So there are some companies that give you very cheap power during the middle of the day. So you might want to pull from the grid in those times, especially on rainy days, to top up your battery to get you through the night. And so I also like to think about the charge rate for that. So if you're planning to pull power from the grid and you get, say, 3 hours of free electricity, you want to be able to get your battery from completely flat to completely full in that 3-hour period. Anyway, so we've charged the battery. Now we discharge it. In this graph here, essentially, we've just changed to highlighting the consumption curve. So the yellow is still everything that was used directly from the solar, but everything in green here is what's being used from the grid directly from the battery. And what we can see is this little bit in grey where the battery just depleted before it charged back up again is what they pulled in from the grid. So this house was basically 99% self-sufficient for that day. I'll just go back one quick slide. What do people think this is? That's the hot water system turning on. This consumption curve. It is almost entirely covered by the solar system, but one of the clever things we can do with some special hot water controllers like the catch I had before is the battery charges up, so there's no excess going to the grid, and as soon as there's enough excess, so the battery's full, the system starts feeding power into the grid, and then the catch controller goes, oh, there's enough power now to cover the running cost of the hot water system, and so then it kicks the hot water in, and then basically chews up the rest. But this is a regular hot water system running here, and that's chewing through about almost 10 kilowatt hours worth of electricity. You can see, compared to everything else, the hot water is one of the biggest power users. If we change this to a heat pump, well, that would bring that... or solar hot water, which is also a good way to do it. Nothing against solar hot water systems. That system might draw about a quarter or a fifth of that electricity, but run for just as long. So it just shows you what an impact using an energy efficient appliances can make. Again, it's the best option. Well, 44 kilowatt hour stack. I mean, there's bigger batteries out there as well. It's a pretty big battery by today's standards. That's honestly what you need to get through the night. Not everybody, by all means. A lot of other people, and this is actually the customer we just looked at before, he only has a 13.5 kilowatt hour battery, which is similar in size to, say, a Tesla Powerwall 3. That gets him through the night most of the time. So if you're the big house with the giant solar array, which is what this house is, you do need something of that capacity, but you also need the solar to be able to charge it. Now, one of the best things that's happened, at least in my industry, but I think it's great for everybody, is the federal battery rebate started this month. And I had the opportunity to meet Chris Bowen and actually basically have some of my systems that I designed as part of their media campaign for the start of the battery bonus scheme. So this was on the 2nd of July, just the other week. Anyway, so we've got the solar system, we've made a house more efficient, we've moved things into the day, we've got a battery to consume the rest of the power, and we're getting ourselves through the night. And now maybe we've looked at getting an electric car to make our house even a little bit more sustainable, or our living a little bit more sustainable. Tying it all together with some electric car charging, or potentially the option for vehicle to grid, which can also be very exciting. But you really want to be able to set the priorities to use that power effectively. How I personally have the electric car, the batteries, the solar, and how I'm set up at home is the house always has the first priority. That's where I want my power to go. Then if there's any excess solar, the car gobbles up the rest first. And then I'll send it to the battery after the car. And then only once the car's full will I send it to the grid. And you sort of go, well, why would you send it to the car before sending it to the battery? That doesn't make much sense. Well, the nice thing is when you have a system that's all integrated, you can tell the car or the battery which to charge first. Or you might even decide, hey, I want to get my home battery to 50% and then give it to the car. And then once the car's done, give the rest of it to the house battery. So if you have a system which is all integrated, you can get really quite sophisticated with some of these setups. So the other thing you can do, and this is what I do at home because frankly, I just don't have enough roof space to be able to fully charge my car and my batteries all off my solar, is I actually use the grid to my advantage. So when there's an excess of solar during the day, especially on a bright sunny day, there are now companies giving incentives where they will give you free electricity between 11 and 2, or if you're paying the wholesale price, sometimes it's even negative. And the thing is, it's actually beneficial for the grid for you to pull power not only from the solar system, but also from the grid. And so you can actually charge both your battery and the car and supply the house all together as one ecosystem. And you can get quite clever with this, and it actually works really well once it's set up. Obviously initially there's a bit of that initial configuration, but once it's all put together, you barely even have to think about it. And I guess this is where I think where it all sort of comes in and what we can do to make the grid itself more sustainable. So one of the great things in Australia is we're now the biggest, or the country with the most amount of solar per capita in the world. I think 30% of homes now have solar, and hopefully soon it'll be that with batteries as well. And the whole reason about the whole reason for the battery rebate is to actually deal with this duck curve. And so what we've got here, and why it's called the duck curve, is because it kind of looks a little bit like a duck. Is in the morning there's a sort of a base load on the grid, on the power stations in terms of the demand on the power stations. Then the sun comes out, and so the solar produces power, and there's a dip in that demand on the grid. And then everyone gets home, turns to the hot water, cooks dinner, turns on the air cons or turns on the heaters, and you get this big spike in the middle of the day, which is the head of the duck. And the problem with this is that it's creating instability in the grid in the middle of the day, which means that we can't actually keep pushing more renewables into the grid at those times. But also we're having to turn on very expensive gas power stations to cover everyone's usage at night. And so what really we want to do is we want to flatten this curve as much as possible. Okay, so we don't really want gas power stations to turn on just because we need to cook dinner. So one way we can do it is we can either, I guess maybe to go through the bad first, there is a glut of solar power in the grid. This might mean that soon, if you've got a really large solar system and you were just planning to feed it heaps of power into the grid to get paid a bit of money for that, soon you might get charged for power that you sell to the grid. It won't be much, and don't be afraid. Look, basically every modern solar system we can set to zero export, so we just tell it do not sell power into the grid, which will fix that problem very quickly. But there is that possibility for instability. So we really want to be able to get more renewables into the grid as well. So what we can do is we can actually limit how much power we flow into the grid on those really bright sunny days, and that's what dynamic export limiting is for. So it's basically Energex being able to control it a little bit better. You can look at installing a battery, and so what you'll do is you basically will absorb the power from the solar and increase the demand during the middle of the day, which will flatten the duck curve a bit. You could also look at charging an electric car, but also what you could do is if you had a battery, you could actually export power when prices are really high here and get paid for it. But also that's when the grid needs that extra capacity. So when I say, it's actually a good thing to charge up your cars and your batteries off the grid during the day, it's really, you're helping everybody by flattening the curve and not using as much here. And so the good part about it is that power can be very cheap during the middle of the day, which means that if you don't have the ability to have a big solar system, or if you've got lots of shade, especially in winter, you're able to still be part of that ecosystem and use other people's solar power, predominantly solar in the middle of the day anyway. You get high feed-in tariffs at night. I've got some customers which are part of virtual power plants or looking at Amber, where they get paid the wholesale price for power. And so, look, that price could vary anything from a few cents all the way to, $15 a kilowatt hour. And if you can feed 10 kilowatt hours into the grid at $15 a kilowatt hour, that's $150 in a night. That's more than what most people's power bills are in a month once you've got solar and a battery. If we can flatten this curve, it'll bring prices down for everybody and make the grid more sustainable overall. And that's really the aim, is making it better for everybody. And lastly, well, again, making it more sustainable. The more power, more solar and wind and hydro we can get into the grid, and the further away we can move from coal, gas, and other non-renewable sources, I think the better it is for not just us in Australia, but everybody else in the world. So just to sort of conclude, I think the most important thing is when we're thinking about a solar system is we need to know what your priorities are. And I think that's important to understand, is figure out what are you putting the solar system and battery for and design it to that purpose. The reality is there's no perfect size, but generally bigger is better. But it will be very much dependent on your circumstances. And that's where, having a consultant or, at least having some of that information handy and working towards your priority is a good plan of attack. And lastly, be clever with the electricity. Even if you don't have the ability to put a solar system up on the roof now, being a little bit cleverer with, getting energy efficient appliances and using power during the day when there's lots of renewables and shifting away from nighttime usage will help everybody. So anyway, if anybody has any questions, I'm very happy to take a few questions. Alrighty. Yes. Hi, Alison. Thank you.
So much on each person's configuration. But if someone was trying to choose between investing money in a factory system at home versus, say, a cheaper ED, plus or minus a virtual power plant, what would them do be since that's that decision making?
No. It's a very good question, because it's a type of question I get asked all the time. And just for the camera, would it be better to buy a cheap EV, or would it be better to invest in a battery system for your home? First thing I would suggest is, look, I'm a big proponent for electric cars. I think they're good for everybody. If you drive a lot, then I think an electric car is a good way of being more energy independent. I definitely would find it really hard to go back to a petrol car. I don't think you would regret either decision, truth be told. If you don't drive a lot, then I think getting a home battery is probably the way to go. I think it is very much dependent on your circumstances. I think at the end of the day, though, it'll probably be a combination of both once the time comes. I think do you have solar already, and do you have the ability to charge during the day, or do you predominantly would be charging at night? Do you regularly work from home where you can charge the car during the day?
Oh, well, yes, I suppose that would be the case, yeah.
Then I would suggest getting the electric car. But I think, look, if just to sort of round out that, vehicle to grid and vehicle to house is still a little bit away. It's coming very quickly, but I wouldn't rush into an electric car right now thinking that you're going to use the car as your home storage for nighttime usage. I think a smaller battery down the track paired with an electric car that can do vehicle to grid will be a very complementary combination, but I don't think you'll have one or the other. I think there'll be a mutually beneficial pairing.
And in your view, for example, the vehicle to eat
type of solutions that are coming online in the next year or two? Look, the legislation's in place. There's already products on the market that can do this. So Sig Energy is a very new brand that can do it. There's other things like the Wallbox Quasar. I think there's an Australian company. I think, don't quote me on the name, but I think it's either Red Earth that does it. There are ways you can do vehicle to grid. The big hurdle at this stage is the car manufacturers not voiding your car warranty doing this. So it's not to say that I don't think it will happen, but it's more than just, hey, my car's capable of doing it and I have a charger. You need to have that communications protocol between the charger and the car.
Just on that point, the technology is there and deployed in other countries.
Yeah.
So there was trial in South Australia where the government, they tried and proved it worked. And then Singapore and parts of Europe are definitely using the technology. It's, to Yorick's point, the OEMs providing the gear to make it compliant with the new legislation, and then the EV manufacturers not voiding yours.
Yeah, it's really that combination. But I would say that it is going to be a question as to whether or not it's going to be through the AC connection or if it's going to be a DC connection. So you can either pull the power out directly as DC and then have an inverter on the wall to do it. That's probably the most universal option. Or a lot of electric cars have the ability for vehicle to load, so you can pull power out of the car as an AC supply. So the car that I drive and I use for camping, I basically got a little power outlet on it. Then you don't have to have a really expensive, dedicated inverter just to pull power out of the car. Personally, unless you're really an early adopter and want to be an early adopter, I would say just hold tight a little bit, get the electric car, live with it, get comfortable with it, get a smart EV charger, and then maybe look at vehicle to grid once it's a little bit more mature. Yeah.
You mentioned VQPs earlier.
Yeah.
Your experience, do battery manufacturers show their warranty if you set up for a VQP?
That's a very good question. So basically every battery manufacturer except for Tesla, but Tesla does have a caveat for VPPs, has a total throughput warranty. So Tesla, which is one that I'm fairly familiar with, basically says you can have unlimited cycles for the 10 years. But if you do sign up with a VPP, then it becomes a throughput warranty. Now, most batteries will basically let you go from completely flat to completely full once a day for about 8 years. The reality is that you're not going to be always fully cycling that battery every single day. So for most people, you should still get the full 10-year warranty under normal use. But it's not specifically because you're part of a VPP, but you might cycle the battery more with a virtual power plant than you would if you were just using like a self-sufficiency mode, for example. Yeah. Yes.
I was going to say the V2G vehicle to grid thing, the setups are expected to be horrendously expensive and shit. But as
Yorick
said, most of these now come with the plug, pick and plug. My daughter had a cyclone, ran her house, ran the fridge, ran a microwave, ran this, ran that for 3 days where there was no power. Still had about 400 kilometers of range on the car.
Yeah.
So there's even just having that capacity just to plug in for emergencies, it is very used.
Yeah.
I mean, point is that the car battery is at least 50 kilowatt hours, maybe a lot more, whereas a home battery is generally 13, 15 if you're lucky. I've got a neighbour who's just put it,
Yeah.
Won't go there. But, so obviously a car is going to be able to run things for a lot longer.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not going to work.
Yeah, I would just give the caveat that I think it's going to be a complementary thing, because the thing is that your car's not always going to be at home. And it's not that if you had a dedicated car just to sit there and act as your battery, that would be fine. But I think that's a waste of having a fully functional electric car. But what I could see, instead of having these big 50 kilowatt hour batteries, for example, maybe you have something that's closer to, say, 10 or 15 that can get you through that, early afternoon till, say, dinner time period. You plug your car in, and then the charger and the battery will sort of decide, okay, do you drain the car battery? Do you discharge the home battery? The thing is, as well, as I think vehicle to grid will become a lot more universal. Let's look, as we move into that realm of the technology, if you can charge at work for free, or you can charge during the day, then I think vehicle to grid makes a lot more sense. But if you're, say, discharging the car and then having to charge it up in the middle of the night from coal, truthfully, I think that that's less beneficial. I mean, it'll definitely help. If I just go back a couple of slides, I mean, it'll definitely help with this, because you could, you bring this down and then you charge your car when there's lower demand. But at least at night at the moment, it's predominantly coal. So if you could charge during the middle of the day, when you're at work for public charging, look, I wouldn't be surprised at some point there'll be very cheap charging with some of the fast chargers during this period here, because the wholesale price will be negative. So the more they can encourage people to chew power up here, the better off we'll all be. Yes.
Could you speak a bit to risks? So we heard some people saying, we don't know batteries, whether they are safe, and fire risk,
Yeah.
insurance.
Look, that's a good question. I have a little bit on the chemistry. There's a big difference between a cheap e-scooter and a home storage system, or even an electric car. Okay, the battery management control, or the battery BMUs, or the battery control units in the home storage systems, are far more sophisticated than your $200 electric scooter or e-bike. So the thing is, as well, it's also a bit dependent on the chemistry too. So predominantly, older battery systems, or even some high-end, electric sports cars, will be nickel, manganese, cobalt. That tends to be a bit more thermally unstable, so it's more likely to have a thermal runaway. Basically, everything for home storage is LFP chemistry. So actually, when I was over in China and I got to see the BYD headquarters, they do a demonstration where they literally puncture through a perfectly good battery, and it hisses a bit, but the nickel manganese cobalt battery from their competitor bursts into flame, and I'm sure they picked one that was particularly prone for that demonstration. The reality is, when it comes to the batteries, look, I think, and this might be not a well-known fact everywhere, but electric cars are far less likely to combust than a petrol car or an ICE car. Your car that's parked in the garage is more likely to spontaneously catch a light than a quality home battery system. Now, it's not to say there's no risks. There's a risk with every appliance that you put in. And look, there is a bit of energy with this batteries. There are very strict fire safety regulations when it comes to batteries. I've actually got a whole video on our YouTube channel which takes you through what are compliant locations and non-compliant locations. But basically, we can't put them in habitable rooms. And this is really that if the worst was to happen, you're not going to get say, noxious gases in an area where you might be sleeping, and it gives you time to escape. But the thing is, the risk of that happening is really low. But obviously, if it was to happen, that's a pretty bad day. Yeah.
Could I just jump up in there?
Sure.
Statistics out of the United States shows that petrol vehicles are 60 times more likely to burn than EVs. 60. Yep. And in Australia, there has not been a fire in an electric vehicle that has started from the car's battery. There have been a few that have been caught up in house fires that started elsewhere. There have been QEV batteries that have caught fire after being damaged and removed from a car and stored badly. But there's not been an EV fire in the Australian EV, and they've been in Australia since 2011. Trent.
Yeah.
Your comment on the Commonwealth Government's scheme.
Yes, I can definitely do that.
About what rebates they are offering.
Yeah. So as of any battery installed, as of the 1st of July this year, and for the next 5 years, there's going to be a federal battery rebate. Now, don't rush in. It's worth getting it done, I think, sooner than later, but I don't feel like you have to rush. We've got a lot of customers calling us up, in particular, saying they need to get in before it runs out. It's fully funded for the next 5 years, but it does reduce every year. Basically, on the 1st of January, it'll drop by about 10%. So at the moment, if anybody's had solar installed, it's basically part of the same scheme. It's just a rejigged version of the solar panel rebate scheme. And so what happens is when we put the battery in, it generates these renewable energy certificates, or STCs. And for every kilowatt hour worth of battery capacity this year, it will produce about 9.3 STCs. Look, depends on the company that's installing it, but at least with MC Electrical, we're getting paid about $37 an STC, so it works out to be about $350 per kilowatt hour worth of storage this year. Next year, it's around about $310 a kilowatt hour. It's not 30%. That's where a lot of, I think, some of the reporting is quite skewed. The rebate can actually be more than 50% of the value of the battery. But on a typical battery installation, once you include cost of, labor and overheads, it works out to be about 30%. So it makes a significant difference in the cost. Because of the scheme is scaled to the size of the battery. If I just go to this page here, and because you can only claim it on the first rebate, I know the writing here is really small. I've actually got a link, a nice, easy link you can follow, or if you want the full link, I've got it on there as well, to the Clean Energy Regulator. But basically, it's for the first battery that's put in. Now, if you have an existing battery and you add to it, you are eligible as long as you haven't claimed a rebate for that first battery. It's up to 100 kilowatt hours worth of storage, but you can only claim to the first 50. So you can put a big community battery in that's a 100 kilowatt hour battery. You'll be able to claim STCs on the first 50 kilowatt hours, and then anything under 50 kilowatt hours, you can claim the rebate for whatever that storage amount is. So we've had a lot of customers, and a bit like your friend who put in the 50 kilowatt hour stack, I've got a few people who've called me up very last minute saying, I want to double my capacity, because it is true. You can only claim it once. And so for those who have the funds to do it and who have the need for that extra capacity, it does kind of make sense to go for the biggest battery possible. Not that they necessarily need that capacity. So I guess it's one of those things. It depends on what you're designing the battery for. But yeah, I think it's worth going a bit bigger than what you need now with how the rebate's structured, and then maybe looking at, say, buying and selling power from the grid as a way of helping out with the duck curve. Yes.
Can you comment a little bit more that the grid and energy providers to be a little bit more sustainable? Because some people don't have a home battery, and then they have maybe solar, and then they have an EV, but then they charge their EVs at night.
Yeah.
They fit the point of, being sustainable because you're using coal to charge your EV and basically running on coal energy. So what's the alternative for those people? Obviously, you don't know where the energy come from in the grid, so you can make probably better choices about your energy provider. Well, I was wondering if you had anything to add.
Yeah. So I've just looked through a slide. I don't have a perfect slide for your particular question, but I have a good suggestion. So there's a company from New Zealand which make an electric car charger called Evnex, and I actually really like this charger. As part of their charger, they track what your carbon footprint is, and on the app, and I've got another video on this particular charger, it'll actually tell you what portion of the grid is coming from coal and wind and solar. So it does encourage you to predominantly charge during the day. The thing is, when it comes to electric car companies, if you can only charge at night, then you're sort of limited by what the mix-up of the grid is. You can pay for green power, obviously, and these schemes are very heavily scrutinized and certified. I know somebody who works at AMO who's been a big part of this. So anyway, what I would suggest is if you wanted to only give money to renewable or environmentally friendly companies, I would be paying for the green power. I think if you have a big enough solar system yourself, you're going to be exporting enough into the grid that you would be efficient. Sort of net zero, I guess, is a way of thinking about it. In terms of
everybody is seeing the same, like we can't be all net zero.
That's correct. Yeah, that's it. In terms of costing, I really like OVO personally. So OVO has a plan, which is what I personally use, where you get free electricity between 11 and 2, which is when there is a lot of solar. And then there is a period between midnight and 6 in the morning, which I know is predominantly coal, but that's when you can charge up relatively cheaply. My recommendation, if you can, would be to lobby either your employer or to try and see if there's ways to charge up during the middle of the day when it is possible, or to try and charge in the middle of the day on the weekend, especially if it's a bright sunny day, if you're wanting to be environmentally friendly with your electric car. But it is obviously that's a lot more sort of habit forming on your own end, and you have to be a lot more proactive about when you charge, which can be difficult for a lot of people. Yes.
This might be outside the sort of purview of what you're talking about tonight.
Sure.
I have heard of electricity suppliers who, with smart meters, identify your peak usage, your most expensive period usage, and charge you for the whole month based on that,
Yes.
rather than charge you on the price where you're using it.
Yes, and this is demand tariffs, and I personally have a real pet peeve against demand tariffs. I think it's a particularly sneaky charge. This is actually where maybe not Amber, but if I just go to something like this, one of the reasons I'm with OVO and I use the plan with that 3 free hour period is so that I always have a fully charged battery by 2 p.m. And if my battery is sized appropriately, that it can get me through till after 9 p.m. because that demand period, at least currently, runs from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. So if you don't import any power from the grid between those hours, you don't get charged demand tariff. Now, I think it's a particularly unfair tariff because you might be a saint and use almost no power at all between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. all month, and then you have one night where you have a party and you've got the oven on, the aircon on, and maybe well, who knows what else, whatever else you're running, and you get pinned for the whole month for that. And I think it would be a much fairer system if you just paid the true cost of power. So look, the thing is, yes, I think if you have a battery, utilizing being able to charge up from the grid during the middle of the day when there's lots of renewables in it is actually beneficial not only for the grid but also for you as the consumer to get around some of these demand tariffs. But the demand tariffs been brought in specifically to try and bring down this demand here. So, but yeah, demand tariffs are particularly sneaky, and it's one that's difficult for people to get their head around.